All right, so the last thing we want to take a look at this chapter is really kind of the elephant in the room when we talk about the antebellum period, slavery. Yesterday we started making the transition and taking a look at Southern culture during this antebellum period. Once again, the word antebellum, a Latin term that literally means before war, in this case before the Civil War. Our overarching theme this chapter is the fact that the Industrial Revolution is taking place during this period of time. And as the North is embracing the Industrial Revolution and their economy and their culture is evolving, the Southerners are rejecting this. Yesterday we talked about how the Southern culture grew, but it did not change. The nature of Southern economy did change from a Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina tobacco industry to a deep South, Georgia, South Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi cotton production. And we talked about the nature of all that changing, but basically it was the same. And we talked about how the Northern culture and the Southern culture of tradition just diametrically were different than one another. The best example we gave at the end of yesterday, we talked about the Brooks-Sumner affair. And this is an event that, as a whole, typifies what was going on in the United States. And once again, as we make our way closer to the Civil War, you're talking about slavery being at the heart of this. When Charles Sumner gave his speech on the Senate floor, it was about slavery. He was comparing slavery to a harlot that the South was enraptured with. And he had made references to Preston Brooks's family in that speech, which is why Preston Brooks felt the need to defend his family honor. But as a whole, when Preston Brooks brutally beat Charles Sumner, the North viewed him as a brutal heathen that needed to be removed from Congress, while Southerners viewed him as a hero. And the state of South Carolina immediately reelected him and sent him straight back to Congress as a reward for his defense of his family. No matter how you slice it, though, everything was continuously coming back to slavery. And what we want to look at here in this last part is, what was the nature of slavery? What really was happening in the United States by this point in time? And so as you take a look at from the Southerners' perspective, Southerners didn't understand why people in the North had such a problem with slavery. And you have to understand why Southerners didn't think slavery was so bad. From their perspective, slavery wasn't as common as people like to think it was. Most people in the South did not own slaves. Less than a quarter of the actual Southern population owned any slaves at all. So what that means is, chances are if you lived in the South during this period of time, you didn't own a slave. And most people you were friends with and you knew, they didn't own slaves either. And most of the people who did own slaves only owned one or two. And if you only own one slave, that means that you're going to treat that slave incredibly well. You're going to feed that slave well. You're going to make sure he has good conditions, to make sure he's fed well, to make sure he keeps his strength up, he stays healthy, he sleeps in a nice place. You're going to make sure that the physical conditions of that slave are good, because a slave was expensive. And so most Southerners saw slavery as something trivial. Most of us don't own one, and if we do own one, we only own one or two, and we treat those slaves incredibly well. The average white person, from the white perspective in the South, was that from their perspective, slavery wasn't that bad. Most people don't own one, and if you own one, you only own one or two, and you treat them very well. However, the reality of slavery in the South is this. If you take a look at what was happening at the time, let's use Mercer County as an example. And these numbers aren't specific to Mercer County, but they're a basic roundabout average to give you an idea of what we're talking about in this example here. If Mercer County was a typical Southern county, let's say that there are 8,000 white farmers living in our county. And in our county, there are 4,000 slaves. Well, if you were really looking at the numbers, you'd say there are 8,000 white people who own 4,000 slaves. That means maybe roughly half the population owns slaves, and they all own one of them. That would be what you would think. If you really think that slavery is common, that would stand to reason and that would make sense. But what happens in the South in reality is that if you had a population of 8,000 people, and that 8,000 people own 4,000 slaves, well, when you're talking about plantation owners, putting this into perspective today, plantation owners were incredibly wealthy. We're not talking people who are doing well for themselves. When we talk about plantation owners, we're talking about the uber rich. Like today, you're talking about wealthy people like Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, some of those wealthiest people in America. Those are the types of people that were plantation owners. So if you look around Mercer County, you're talking about people who had millions of dollars. And if you're looking around Mercer County, there may be 2, 3, or 4 families that would have enough money that they probably could have owned plantations back then. So what happens in reality in the South is if there's 8,000 farmers in our county, 2 of them might be plantation owners, and those 2 plantation owners own 2,500 slaves. Now, if they're only a quarter of the population owns slaves, then that means that of the 8,000 people that live in Mercer County, 1,200 of them own slaves. Those 1,200 people own 1,500 slaves, which means of that 1,200, most of them only own 1 slave, and 300 of them own 2 slaves. 2 people own 2,500 slaves, 1,200 people own 1,500 slaves. Of that 1,200, most of them only own 1. Now, that seems bad enough. 1,200 people owning 1,500 slaves. 2 people owning 2,500 slaves. That seems bad. But when you take a look at the numbers in the South, in that period of time, if Mercer County was a southern county, of the 8,000 farmers, 6,798 of them never owned a slave and were never going to own a slave. So from the white people's perspective, why is slavery such a big deal? Most of us don't own slaves. If we do own a slave, we only own 1 or 2, and we treat them very well. And yes, plantations are probably harsh, but they're so rare, it's really not that big of a deal. And so the typical Southerner was actually poor, rather uneducated. And why would Southerners be so defensive of this system, this slavery system? Well, A, because it's tradition. Remember, Southern culture, it's tradition. This is the way we've always done things. It's the way we're going to continue to do things. B, if I'm a poor white Southerner and I don't own slaves and I don't benefit from the system, why would I support it? Well, because my situation may be bad, but I'm always better than somebody else. Remember, we talked about this yesterday, that cult of honor, they reflected European culture. If you're a lowly peasant, the one thing you take pride in, at least you're not a slave. And third of all, remember, if I am a poor white farmer owning my own small farm, I don't have a local town nearby where I sell my cotton. I don't have a local town nearby where I get all my supplies. Where do I get everything that I need? From the plantation owner. I'm still dependent on a plantation owner to get the things that I need, even if I'm not a wealthy plantation owner myself. Here's the great irony of the whole thing, though. Those overwhelming majority of Southerners who didn't own slaves would have probably been better off if the system of slavery didn't exist. Think about this. Simple supply and demand. The more you supply something, the cheaper it becomes. If you remember yesterday, we talked about the production of cotton in the United States. By 1860, 5 million bales of cotton a year are being produced in the United States. What does 5 million bales of cotton do to the price of cotton in the United States? It drives the price down. Who's producing those 5 million bales of cotton? Plantation owners. And how are they doing it? By using slaves. You see, if they'd gotten rid of slavery earlier, the plantation owners wouldn't have been able to produce nearly as much cotton, which would have drove the price of cotton up, which would have made it more profitable for poor farmers. If poor farmers had been supportive of getting rid of slavery earlier, they would have made more money. Now, speaking of plantations, this is the engine that drives the South. Wealthy plantation owners run the economy. They run local society. They also run the government. What does life look like on a plantation owner? Well, generally speaking, there are 2 systems that you would have run through a plantation. One is called the task system. You take all your slaves out in the morning, you take them out to a certain area, and we have a task that needs to be accomplished today. You tell the slaves we have to clear this square so many acres of land today, and when they accomplish their task, they're done for the day. And the slaves can go back to their living quarters, back to their lives, and go back to doing whatever it is that they do. The task system was more commonly used on rice and sugar plantations. The reason why is because it was very easy to be able to tell when a task was adequately completed. You tell them they have to clear so much land, so many acres today of the rice and the sugar. Well, we can easily see if it's cleared or not. At the end of the day, whenever they've done the task to our liking, they're done for the day. It was not easy to use the task system on cotton plantations. It's not as easy to be able to tell whether or not the slaves have picked adequately enough cotton in each particular row. You can't just give them so many rows and say, pick all the cotton there. It would have taken too long. So the system that was more common in cotton plantations was called the gang system. Slaves were broken up into multiple different groups called gangs, and each gang was led by either an overseer or a head driver. Overseers were poor white people that were employed by the plantation owner, and their job was to run a gang of slaves. An overseer might be in charge of 12 to 15 slaves, and at the end of the day, the overseer is in charge of watching his group of slaves working on their rows of cotton. And they're judged by how much cotton they pick at the end of the day. This is why you would use this system in a cotton plantation more than you would use the task system. Because if you use the gang system, we're not talking about trying to clear a number of rows. We're talking about picking each plant as clean as you possibly can. Slaves would be judged on how many pounds of cotton they could pick a day. So a good overseer or a head driver could easily encourage their slaves to pick considerable amounts of cotton. At the end of the day, they weigh it, and the gangs that did better got more rewards. Now, once again, each of these gangs is led by either an overseer or a head driver. An overseer is a poor white person. A head driver is a fellow slave that's in charge of the task. The fact is, most slaves would have preferred to have an overseer, not a head driver. Typically, what we saw as a result is that head drivers, fellow slaves who were given the responsibility of running a gang, were much more harsh because they feared their owners more. If I'm a fellow slave and I am a head driver in charge of everybody to pick their cotton, if they don't pick the adequate amount of cotton today, well, my punishment is that I'll probably get whipped on a plantation. And so that drives me to perhaps be more harsh with my fellow slaves. And so what we see as a result of this is this entire system is incredibly cruel using it. Some head drivers and overseers motivated their slaves through fear and pain, and some were relatively friendly, just like a boss might be, or somebody who's a foreman on a crew in a northern factory. What we do know about this is that because slaves were so expensive and they were so valuable to the operation, the physical conditions of slavery were not bad. Slaves were rarely whipped and beaten. Slaves were very rarely starved. And slaves were generally clothed and housed properly. The reason why, if a slave dies, that's a monetary loss that most plantation owners didn't want to have. The only reasons you would see slaves beaten and mistreated on a wide number is if you had a massive plantation with a super rich plantation owner who was able to afford a significant number of slaves. But what we know is most plantation owners even didn't have a ton of money. And so what we know is that most of these plantation owners treated the slaves well, and the physical conditions of slavery were better than the conditions of working in a northern factory, and considerably better than European peasants working in factories over in Europe. Lastly, the last thing we're going to take a look at is what does it look like to be a slave here in the United States? Slave culture. Back in 7th grade world cultures with Mr. Razavi, you guys learned about the various different parts of civilization. Different communities, shared language, shared customs, shared religion. shared education systems, all shared family structures. This is the elements that create a culture. And the slaves, one of the most remarkable parts of slavery is how the slaves created their own culture, independent from white American culture, right under the noses of their masters, without the masters really recognizing it. So, for example, one of the elements of civilization, common language. The slaves developed a language that wasn't quite English, but it wasn't quite African dialects. The slaves had to find ways to communicate with each other when they first came over from Africa. There are many different dialects of African Swahili languages. They had to combine them all so they could communicate with one another. And so this language they created was Pidgin. It was a mixture of multiple Swahili languages with English. And if you were listening to slaves speaking Pidgin, there are a number of English words you could have easily figured out, but you wouldn't have been able to fully understand the language. They created this language to communicate without their masters knowing. And so Pidgin survived long after the slave trade to Africa had ended. Most of the slaves by the time of the Civil War had never been to Africa, were never going to go to Africa, but they spoke Pidgin, which was a blend of African Swahili with English, so that they could communicate without masters fully knowing. Music. Music is an element of society, civilization. Slaves developed their own types of music. Slave spirituals. And because most masters didn't want to educate their slaves or anything, they still wanted them to practice Christianity. Most slave music had Christian tones, Christian hymns, but they combined them with African beats. And so that's where you get the slave spirituals that are upbeat and everything. One of the interesting things that slaves did, though, was if you look at the lyrics are depressing. The lyrics reflect how downtrodden they are about their situation, but they couple it with an upbeat rhythm so that the masters don't really pay attention to the words. They only see the rhythm. And the masters think that slaves are happily working in the fields without listening to the lyrics and the actual messages. Religion. Once again, masters wanted their slaves to become Christian and save their souls. And so slaves were able to develop their own brand of Christianity where they practiced religion, but with their own spin, where they would use the types of customs and traditions that were present in African voodoo and Islam, which recreates this new brand of African slave Christianity during the period of time. And lastly, you look at these elements of culture that exist. They had their own types of families. Slave families, though, don't look like a normal family because the situation for slaves is so unstable that anything could be taken away from them at any time. Mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, aunts, uncles, cousins. There is no traditional sense of family for slaves. What they do have is their family is who you happen to be with. And so there's much more of a communal sense of the community becomes your family. Whatever plantation I'm on, the slaves on this plantation, they are my family. There is no biological sense of family because families could be separated, and often white people separated the families intentionally to keep the slaves constantly in a situation of flux and instability. Rebellions. People want to think that slaves ran away or they rebelled or that there were slave revolts, but the fact of the matter is it was incredibly rare. Even the Underground Railroad, the famous Underground Railroad that helped slaves escape to the north later on in this antebellum period, was very marginally successful. You can only sneak slaves out of the South if they were in places like Kentucky, Maryland, or parts of Virginia. Anything deeper south than that, forget about it. You weren't going to be able to easily get them out of there. Very rarely did you have slaves run away because particularly the deeper south you got, it was very difficult for them to be able to navigate their way without being found by other slave owners or other white people and then simply sent back to their farms and then summarily punished. The most common form of resistance of slaves was not to rebel, not to revolt, or to run away, but simply to be passive aggressive. Slaves would break tools. They would complete tasks poorly. And this would give masters the impression that slaves simply weren't capable of doing more. You see the slave, every time you send him out to the field, he breaks a tool, does something wrong, and the white people said, well, he's just so ignorant, he can't even help himself, that's all the better he can do. And what the white people didn't realize was this was actually a form of rebellion. Slaves were capable of considerably more. They were breaking the tools because they hated their owners. They were doing stuff poorly because they didn't want to do it. It's like when my wife asks me to wash the dishes and I do it badly every time and I put the dishes back in the wrong spot. She thinks I'm an idiot and I'm not capable of doing it, but what's really happening is I really don't want to do the task. I do it bad enough, and what does she do? She takes over and does it for me. A classic example of this is the Sambo. This is your stereotypical slave who shuffles, stares at the ground, mumbles, refuses to make eye contact. White people thought that these slaves were just poor, lowly people who were not capable of any more. But what was really happening is that slaves were putting on an act. They were breaking tools. They were doing tasks poorly. The Sambo was refusing to make eye contact. He was mumbling. He was shuffling his feet and looking at the ground because he hated his master. He wanted to create frustration from the master because he didn't do the tasks properly. He wanted them to think he was stupid, but in reality, he just despised them so much he didn't want to do their work for them. The only element of education, the only element of society that slaves did not create on their own was education. There was never a system of education for slaves. They had common language, they had common religion, common music, common structures. All of those family structures, all of that, these elements of society were present, but there was no education. Because in the South, the one thing you never do is educate a slave so that they find a way to run away.